All right. Thanks, Julia. And I appreciate the almost promotion there for a moment. But since my boss is on the line, we'll stick with my current job. Hi, everyone, and welcome to our latest installment of the Southern California News Group's Newsmaker Series. During these crazy days of the pandemic, I know we've all done a lot of reading. Fortunately, many of you are reading our newspapers and websites. And of course, we're all reading books. The Southern California News Group wanted to do something kind of cool for our readers, and we decided to embrace technology to do that. If we can't all gather in one physical location, we could do it in a virtual environment like this. We've ventured into the sports world and will again starting next week with a series previewing the resumption of the NBA season and the beginning of the baseball and NFL seasons. We had a terrific discussion and kind of a private concert yesterday with Grammy-nominated reggae band Common Kings last night. And for all of our book lovers, we have our Lit Up series every Friday, hosted by author Sandra Singh Loh. Her guests for tomorrow are authors Susan Straight, Luis Alfaro, and Viet Thanh Nguyen, a Pulitzer Prize winner and a former guest of our book club. He's a really fascinating guy. We also decided that during the pandemic to do something that is a bit of a throwback. My boss, SCNG Executive Editor Frank Pine, suggested that we serialize a book. We decided to do it with Peter Houlahan's Norco 80, the true story of the most spectacular bank robbery in American history. We did it over 14 installments in our 11 newspapers and on our websites. Tonight, we'll bring all that together with what we think will be a great event. Our host this evening has been the moderator of our past book club events and regularly covers the fascinating people and events in the entertainment field. And for tonight's proceedings, I need to tell you a little bit about his desk here in Anaheim. I'm fairly certain Peter Larson is the tallest reporter we have in the Southern California News Group, but I can't see him in the days when he actually can be at his desk, because he's actually surrounded by books that go well above where his head goes. Pete loves his books, and I think tonight's gonna be a good one. So I'd like to introduce you all to our Orange County Register and Southern California News Group entertainment reporter, Peter Larson, the commissioner of one of my fantasy baseball leagues, and our host for this evening. Peter?
Thank you, Todd. I appreciate the shout out to my desk. I miss it still 3 months later, so maybe one day. Tonight should be a good conversation. I first met Peter Houlahan by phone a year ago when his book Norco 80 came out in hardcover, and I want to tell you a little bit about him before we start our conversation. Peter's an author, a freelance writer, and a book review contributor whose work has appeared in publications such as LA Magazine, Salon, Hearst Newspapers, Los Angeles Review of Books, and of course the Southern California News Group. And Norco 80, the true story of the most spectacular bank robbery in American history, is truly spectacular. We're going to get into some of what make it that way in a moment. But one sense, if you need to check a scorecard to know that, is that it was nominated for an Edgar Award and a Hammett Award, chosen as a New York Times summer pick, an NPR, also an NPR favorite book of 2019, among other accolades. In addition to being a writer, Peter has worked as an emergency medical technician for a number of years in his life, and as we'll talk about in a minute, that kind of gave him some insight and some access when he was starting to do the research for this book. So he and I will talk for about half an hour, then we'll bring in Sergeant McCarty, and then a little bit after that we will take questions from folks. My first question for you, Peter, would be, tell us a little bit about what you saw in your local newspaper 40 years ago that stuck with you and decades later kind of got your mind going and thinking of, you know, that event was something unusual. I think I should be able to write something about that.
Yeah, and thank you so much for having me, and to the paper, Southern California News Group, for running the serial. That was really fantastic of you guys. I was 17 years old. I was in Whittier, California, where I'd grown up, and I was a bit of a news junkie, and especially read the the papers every day, and it was actually, I first heard of it the following morning. The event itself was Friday afternoon into the evening. I opened up the newspaper and saw a photograph of one California Highway Patrol officer bandaging another, and the headline that said "Shootout on Mount Baldy." And I was absolutely captivated by it. You know, the news was still trickling in at that point. They were still fugitives up in the mountains, and but the scope of the incident itself was staggering. And back in those days, you know, you didn't turn on 24-hour news. It wasn't looping the same thing over and over. There weren't video cameras on every corner. So you were really bringing it in, or I was, by through the newspaper, and then, you know, some evening news on the television. But it always stuck with me. And years later, I would tell people occasionally about the Norco bank robbery, and they'd usually say two things. You know, did that really happen? And the other would be, how come I've never heard of this? And so anything that happens on such a scale and such a scope and such a tragedy, you know, there's got to be bigger stories involved and you know, encapsulated within. So when I started looking into it, and especially started speaking with some of those who were involved, the deeper story really began to reveal itself.
Yeah.
And it really, you know, it was clearly a story that needed to be told, or should be told.
Right. I assumed, perhaps incorrectly, that, you know, most folks who are on here today kind of know the basic outlines of the robbery, but in a nutshell, and we'll get more into this in a minute, 5 guys decided to stick up the Security Pacific Bank in Norco. They were heavily armed. Things didn't go well for them, but they managed to get away with a hostage. A 2-county chase started that led up into the mountains, where a gun battle finally brought most things to an end before a long court case after that. So tell us, having sort of set the table for, you know, both that startling photo you saw of the highway patrol officers and also how that intrigued you, when approximately did you start work on the book? You know, what was it that kind of took it from, this is a fascinating story, I know there's a great tale here, to I'm going to be the one who tells this tale?
Well, I was actually thinking about writing an article on the 30th anniversary, and began to dig around a little bit, and I ended up not doing that. But that's when it sort of revealed to me that it was a much larger story than even I knew of. And so in all, it took 5 years to research and write this book, starting towards the end of 2014. And it started out as all research, and then gradually it becomes more writing and less research, but really researched all the way through to the end, because there was such a tremendous amount of documents, individuals to speak with, and you know, all sorts of things, and continues to be people that I've run into right up until we went to press with it. So in all, it was quite an endeavor. It was about 5 years total, beginning in late 2014.
Right. You mentioned all the research, and I know you've given me these figures before, but how many boxes and how many documents did you end up with?
Yeah, one thing that's an advantage to a writer working on a true crime story, especially one that goes to trial, is that there's tremendous amount of documentation. There are police reports, there are police interviews with with witnesses, with other police law enforcement officers. There are trial transcripts. So there is a tremendous amount. And even though the incident was 35 years old at the time, 40 now, there was still 35 boxes of trial transcripts sitting over at the Attorney General's office. That's about 70,000 pages of transcripts. There were about 5,000 to 7,000 police reports and investigation reports, and all kinds of documentation done by the investigators for the prosecution, for the district attorney's office, investigators for the Riverside Sheriff's Office, the San Bernardino Sheriff's Office. So it was a matter of trying to chase down every document you could find. And then, of course, the real heart and soul of the story is speaking to those who lived it. And in the end, I spoke to well over 100 people involved.
When you went from the more, paper research side of things into the interpersonal interviews with law enforcement officers, witnesses, attorneys, any kind of people that, might have had a part to play in this, how easy or difficult was it for you to get people to sit down and talk to you? Was this an episode that people were happy to talk about? Were there still old kind of bruises about the violence that had come to town that day?
Yeah, it's a very sensitive issue on all different kinds of levels for those involved. It was an extremely difficult event to have been involved in for law enforcement and for civilians who found themselves caught up in it. It had a profound impact. Of course, there was a deputy lost. There were others wounded, and there was also a lot of controversy afterwards. A lot of hard feelings between the Riverside deputies and their own department, and that took a while to heal. I think if I would have tried to write this book on the 25 years after it happened, certainly 20 years after it happened, I think a lot of folks would not have wanted to speak with me. It just was too sore a subject, too raw. And but I think as it became 35 years and some bridge building in between, and most people felt like it was an important part of their life, and they really wanted to have this story told. And they felt by participating and talking to me that it would become a richer, more fuller, accurate story. Yeah, there were some that were a lot harder to get to speak with me. The surviving bank robbers, it wasn't until a year or two into it and before I was able to sit down and talk to them.
Yeah. Well, let's break off the bank robbers and talk about them for a minute, because they weren't just guys out to make a lot of money by robbing a bank. They had some other interests or beliefs that kind of were part of the reason why this started. George Smith, I believe, was sort of the ringleader of it, if I remember that part right. But tell us a little bit about, who George Smith was and who these other guys were, and kind of what their point of view was, I guess, that led them to knock off this bank.
Well, these were 5 young men, all out of Orange County. Thank you, Orange County. They were led by, they're all in their mid-20s, and then 2 younger ones that I'll speak of in a moment. The person who put it all together and whose idea this was a fellow named George Wayne Smith. And George Wayne Smith had several primary motivations in this and things that propelled him towards this. And one is George got involved in the very aggressively evangelical, born-again, end times theology churches out of Orange County that were part of the Jesus movement that came out of Orange County in the 1970s. And they were very heavy on end times, on Book of Revelation, you needed to prepare for and be prepared for the end times that could come at any moment, and the apocalypse and things like that. I'm not suggesting that participation or in those churches necessarily leads one to this, but for George, he took it to heart, and he was a guy of action. He was also a guy of some grandiosity, and had also fallen on some hard times in his personal life. He was about 27 years old when he got in his mind that he wanted to rob a bank. And one of his motivations was to get enough money so that he could start stockpiling even more weapons and buy a cabin up in the Utah mountains, bring all of his loved ones there, ride out the apocalypse and any of the tribulations and things that would lead up to the rapture and any number of he had kind of an interesting look at the end times theology. But that was George Wayne Smith's motivation. His roommate was Chris Harvin, who also helped put this together. Chris was kind of just a general troublemaker. None of them had any serious records criminal records, no history of violence. Chris kind of went along with it, but and you know he was a bit of a survivalist and kind of had these beliefs in doomsday scenarios that were bandied about in the 1970s, asteroid strikes, particularly something called the Jupiter effect, which was a alignment of planets that was going to cause volcanic activity and earthquakes, and that would break California off into the sea. Chris recruited his yellow brother, Russell Harvin, and then they recruited the Delgado brothers. Manny Delgado was only 21 years old. He knew George and Chris. They worked at the Parks Landscaping for City of Cypress, and then Manny recruited his 17-year-old brother Billy Delgado, and you know, all of them had their own motivations, but the real driving force was George and Chris and their kind of doomsday scenarios of different varieties.
Right. So they make their plan. They gather a tremendous amount of weaponry, and the robbery begins. Tell us what went wrong with their plan to get in and out. Tell us what went wrong with the way the initial police response, you know, rushed up to it, and you know, the gun battle began. Well, put us in that spot
Sure.
in Norco when all of this starts to go down.
Sure. The way that these bank robbers prepared for this was that they armed themselves with high-powered semi-automatic rifles, 223s. George was firing a 308 with thousands of rounds of ammunition, high-capacity magazines. They had also made homemade explosive devices that they could either launch out of the barrel of a shotgun or simply light a fuse and throw it out. These were fragmentation grenades. It was a rather grandiose plan, which in some ways guaranteed that something would go wrong along the way. But the general motto and approach to it was that they were not going to be taken alive. And so this was a takeover robbery of the Security Pacific Bank in Norco. They started that morning by stealing a van at gunpoint from the Brea Mall, tying up the owner in the back, a man named Gary Hackala, tied him up and shoved him into a closet in the back so that they would commit the robbery with this van. And then they set off a diversion bomb underneath a gas main a mile away. And this is the first thing that went wrong. The diversion bomb fizzled. They had expected to blow up the gas main. Every first responder in Norco is a mile away. They hit the bank, and then they're out of there in 2 minutes, in and out of the bank. Diversion bomb didn't go off. And that's when they probably should have called it a kidnapping and gone home. But George Smith at 3:30, it's an afternoon, Friday afternoon, May 9th, 1980, they go into Security Pacific Bank. As with most takeover robberies, which is when the bank robbers go into a bank, they say everybody down on the floor, they take over the bank, they empty the vault, the teller drawers, everything. You know, it was chaotic and dramatic, but they did leave the bank in about 2.5 minutes. And when bank robbers get caught, it's usually a mixture of poor planning and bad luck. And in this case, as they exited the bank, there was a deputy, Glenn Belaski, Riverside Sheriff's Deputy Glenn Belaski, happened to be in his patrol unit at the corner of 4th and Hamner, looking straight at the Security Pacific Bank. The bank robbers had actually been spotted entering the bank by a teller at a bank across the street. They were in camouflage, ski masks, holding high-powered rifles. She spotted them, called the sheriff's office. So when they came out of that bank, Glenn Belaski was receiving the transmission telling him there was a 211 in progress, Security Pacific Bank, 4th and Hamner. And Glenn Belaski went headlong into 4 heavily armed men and a 17-year-old getaway driver, Billy Delgado. And it became a ferocious firefight. 3:30 on a Friday afternoon in a crowded Southern California intersection.
Yeah. As they fled, tell us a little bit about the flight and the pursuit, because this is one of the most dramatic parts of the book, when you're describing this kind of rolling gun battle that eventually, you know, leads across two two counties, with people shooting out of the van at police vehicles. I think they were throwing some of those improvised explosives out of the van as well. We got some emails in advance of this talk tonight from people who remember hearing, gunfire from their backyards just like relentlessly as this thing was going on. So, what was it? What happened, and why were they able to continue to flee and get away? What kept them from getting boxed in somewhere along the way?
Yeah, the complexion of this pursuit changed so dramatically. It started with a pitched firefight as I said, in a Southern California intersection in which over 500 rounds were fired, and numerous civilians and deputies. Glenn Belaski was badly injured. There was a fatality. One of the bank robbers gets killed. They bail out of their van and they get into a pickup truck that's built up fortified with heavy cabinets on the side. And they are armed with their semi-automatic rifles, and they've got their explosive devices. They've got thousands of rounds of ammunition. George Smith and Russell Harvin are in the back. Manny Delgado sits out of the passenger seat of the cab, out the window. And so he is shooting over the cab, and Chris Harvin's driving the truck. And they start off on a running gun battle through the streets of Miraloma and up through Wineville, straight up Hamner Avenue North, up to Wineville, and then Miraloma. And they're trying to get back to their house in Miraloma, which they had already turned into a bit of a compound and a fortress to prepare for the apocalypse. They had an escape pit dug in there. But, the sheer firepower of this vehicle and what the law enforcement was trying to do, were trying to, read their radio traffic and tell each other, okay, they're turning here, but they were weaving their way through side streets, turning every block. So most of the law enforcement officers that came upon them, California Highway Patrol, Riverside deputies at first, they had no chance to kind of set up. Suddenly that truck was right on them. And they were taking fire. Their vehicles were getting hit multiple times. And as that pursuit runs up through Wineville, Miraloma, there are several civilians, but there are 6 law enforcement officers who are hit by gunfire in less than in about 15 minutes. And to hear the radio traffic, which still does exist, is chilling. To hear, officer down, officer hit. And they're constantly calling for ambulances. And it's that sheer firepower. Plus, they were in this Ford F-250 pickup truck with the sides built up with cabinets filled with tools and things that they had carjacked at the intersection. So it was a absolute free-for-all. And as you mentioned, after that, it went on to the freeway and onto the I-15, headed towards north on I-15, and they were hitting police vehicles from a half mile away with those weapons. The California Highway Patrol was involved at that point. San Bernardino Sheriff become involved. There's other police, city police agencies that are on, and that's when they take a shot and hit and downed a San Bernardino police helicopter. It's when they started to throw explosive devices out that were peppering civilian vehicles and law enforcement vehicles, and then it heads up into Lytle Creek, and it changes very ominously once it starts to head up into the mountains. Yeah, if that wasn't ominous enough.
Yeah, seems plenty ominous. Before we go up to Lytle Creek, explain a little bit about the technology that was available to law enforcement at the time, both in terms of the weapons they had compared to what the robbers had, and also a little bit about the ability to communicate, which I believe was an issue as well in how this was tackled.
Yeah, it certainly was. Told you what the bank robbers were firing that day and how they were armed. Well, back in those days, the deputies were guarding the Wild West with the same thing that deputy sheriffs have been guarding it for 100 years, and that was with a 6-shooter and a Winchester shotgun. And so that's what, and California Highway Patrol, the same. They did not have high-powered rifles in their patrol units. The sheriff's departments did not have SWAT teams until later on. Riverside certainly did not. And so they were woefully outgunned in this battle, all the way from start to finish, while it was a running gun battle. The other is the communications. There were 5 agencies that were significantly involved. Different agencies: San Bernardino, Riverside, California Highway Patrol, Riverside City PD, Fontana City. So there were a number involved, and for the most part, they could not speak to each other over the radio frequencies. They were operating on different radio frequencies. And if you had a scanner, you could hear some of the other frequencies, but you couldn't speak to them. There was an interagency radio system that was just being introduced at the time. It was called Claymars, which was a common channels you could go to. But for the most part, Riverside only had one of those in the pursuit. And that became quite a deal later on. But they really couldn't speak to each other. And it became a very, very big deal later on when you had a helicopter in the air from San Bernardino, and the lead units in the pursuit were California Highway Patrol and then Riverside Sheriff's Patrol, trying to tell each other, where this truck is and where the suspects are. I must say it's not gotten tremendously better since then. I know in my work as a EMT, but it was particularly difficult and frustrating then. It was almost like a game of telephone. Someone would have to tell someone, and they'd have to tell their people, or someone would overhear it from another frequency, and they'd have to then tell it all to their people, or even go through the dispatchers to spread information between the different units. Made it hard to do things like set up roadblocks in advance and all that kind of thing.
Yeah. I think it's a good point here to bring in DJ McCarty. If we could pop him up on the screen. Hello there. Can you hear us and see us okay?
We can hear you.
Okay, good. DJ McCarty is a retired detective and sergeant from the San Bernardino Sheriff's Department. 40 years ago, he plays a part in what we're about to get to here. He grabbed one of the only high-powered weapons that the department had, which actually wasn't, I don't believe, the department's own weapon, which we'll ask you about in a minute, and joined the pursuit. So maybe we could start there. You were working in San Bernardino that day, and how did you first hear this come across the radios, or how were you alerted of it, and kind of how did you join in?
Well, I was working patrol on day shift that day, and I was just getting off, and they have a squawk box back in our dressing room. Mm-hmm. And I heard that 40 King was taking shots and was going down. In the area that he was reporting is a grape vineyard, and I was thinking maybe that it was a hunter that just went off and started shooting at the chopper. So when I came out and started listening a little bit closer, it was obvious that it was not a hunter, that it was a full-scale war that was going on out there.
So at what point did you become involved in it? You were coming off your shift, but how did you realize, or how did you go back to work, I guess, as this event was moving into San Bernardino County and kind of up into the mountains?
Well, all of this happened real quick. Jim McFerrin was on patrol, and he was out in the field, and he heard what was going on before I did and knew that we were basically outgunned. So he radioed in to have someone meet him in the back lot with the AR-15. And we had a new sergeant at that time that wasn't sure where it was at. So I went out and showed him that it was in the trunk of his vehicle. And about the time that the trunk got popped open, I grabbed the rifle, and McFerrin came flying into the back lot. And he unlatched the passenger door, and I looked at the sergeant, he looked at me, and I grabbed the rounds of the rifle and jumped in.
And tell why was that the one high-powered rifle that the department had?
Well, our arsenal in those days in 1980 consisted of 2 Korean War or World War II 30 caliber automatic or semi-automatic rifles, which, if anybody knows their weapons, they're not a real, they're a trench gun. They're a close quarter gun. The other, I think, 8 to 10 rifles that we had where John Wayne used them at one time because they were all lever action Winchester rifles for shooting people off of horses. That was the extent of our arsenal. The weapon, the AR, we recovered as a stolen. There was a pursuit prior to this, and they threw the weapon out the window of the car as they were trying to evade. And we recovered the rifle. It was stolen from the military. We called the military. We told them we got the rifle back and told them there was some damage to it, and do you want it back? And they said no. Well, in 1980, a weapon like that was gold to law enforcement because none of us had anything that qualified to get into a basic war with. And that's how we came up with the rifle. Technically, we shouldn't have kept it. It should have gone to our range, and we knew if we sent it to the range to be qualified as our weapon, because it has to be tested and shot, that we'd never see it again, that the range would take it and it would wind up in somewhere else or not back to Fontana Station.
Right.
So that's how we got the rifle.
Okay. Let me go back over to Peter and have you take us up the dirt roads or whatever they were into Lytle Creek. Then we'll come back to DJ in a minute when he arrives on the scene up there. But tell us, once they get off Interstate 15 and start to head into rougher terrain, take us through that a little bit.
Yeah, many of the law enforcement vehicles and officers following had an idea where these guys might be going. If they kept going straight, they were going to go over the Cajon Pass and into the Mojave Desert, which is hard to evade anybody there. So they weren't entirely surprised when they got off on Sierra Avenue and started to head out into the San Gabriel National Forest, and that area is Lytle Creek. And those of you who are from the area know that those are extremely rugged mountains and rugged terrain. And that's a 2-lane road, one going each way, that starts to wind up the mountain. At that time, there was the truck in the lead, and about 40 law enforcement vehicles behind them, and a mixture of, again, different agencies. And then there's DJ and Jim McPherron flying in from Fontana Station, and their goal is to try to reach the front of the pursuit line to bring that weapon to bear in any altercation they may have with these heavily armed suspects. So as they are going up the pursuit line and working their way up past 30 or 40 vehicles, they are trying to get the word out that there's an SO unit with an automatic weapon, get out of their way. DJ's working the loudspeaker on the top of the PA system on top of the unit to try to work their way up. So there's that drama unfolding. But as they work their way up Lytle Creek, the lead units are taking a lot of fire from this truck, and the truck is starting to pull ambushes on them. They're slowing up around curves so that when the law enforcement comes around the corner, the guys in the back open up on them with the ARs, or they stop on the horseshoe curves and fire across the canyon at them. So there's a lot of ambush as well as this running gun battle, which is now a single file pursuit going up with one helicopter, and that's 40 King 1 at that point. 40 King 2 got shot down over Fontana. And so the road then goes from asphalt, and then it becomes dirt, and it's an extremely rugged dirt track, and it becomes more and more rugged, more perilous, more narrow as this pursuit sometimes as slow as 10 and 15 miles an hour. Sometimes it speeds up to 30 miles an hour. Again, they're being ambushed along the way. Vehicles are falling out. Vehicles are being hit by gunfire. They're bottoming out, and they're also rising in altitude. So they're up to 3,000 feet around Lytle Creek Village. As they get up to around 4,000 feet, they start to get up to Stockton Flats. They're up around 5,000 feet, starting to get cold. It started as a warm, sunny day in Norco, is now getting close to freezing, and it's just becoming more and more ominous, more and more perilous, more dangerous for a lot of reasons. And DJ and Jim McPherson are trying to work their way up to the front of that pursuit line.
But we'll come back to DJ and Jim McPherson, but let's bring in Deputy Bill Evans and talk about him.
Yeah, Jim Evans. Yeah.
I'm sorry, Jim Evans.
Yeah,
and,
sure.
And talk about him for a minute, because he was unfortunately the one law enforcement officer, the one non-bank robber to die in this event. So he was up at the front of the line. I'm recollecting, but tell us a little bit about, where he was in this pursuit up these little narrow roads in the mountains, and kind of, how he came upon them.
Yeah, Jim entered the pursuit on I-15 and had worked his way up towards the front. When they started to go up Lytle Creek, there were a couple of California Highway Patrol units in the lead, followed by Jim Evans. And Jim Evans was 38 years old. He was a Green Beret, Vietnam War combat veteran, soft-spoken Texan. When you listen to the radio traffic, you can hear him immediately. He's got that West Texas drawl. All the deputies looked up to him, just kind of a quiet hero, a real big-hearted guy. But he started to work his way up the pursuit line, and as vehicles dropped out, he had worked his way up, and he was just up at Stockton Campground, Stockton Flats. He took over the lead at the last moment, right as DJ and Jim McPherson were reaching the front of the line, and so Jim had been taking fire during this whole time, and he takes the lead right when this pursuit enters Baldy Notch, what's known as Baldy Notch Road, which is a fire road accessible only to supposedly to hikers and the Forest Service. So that's how the pursuit line is at the time they enter, and that is a narrow, perilous, steep incline, just clinging to the side of Mount Baldy. Sometimes the drops off the side are 500 feet down, and with a steep incline on the other side. So it's the truck is moving up that with Jim Evans, and then DJ and Jim McPherson right behind that, and followed by some California Highway Patrol. And again, the pursuit line is still 30 vehicles at that point, stretching back for a mile or so.
Right. And did the truck the truck break down or get stuck? How was it that Jim Evans got ambushed by them?
Yeah, if you listen the whole way up, Jim Evans, like I said, a Green Beret combat veteran, he knows an ambush, and he keeps trying to talk to this San Bernardino helicopter that's up there, that's relaying information, and Jim's Riverside. So he has to go. Jim has to talk to another Riverside deputy with Claymars, who then's talking to the helicopter. The helicopter is giving the answers back. They're being relayed to Jim Evans. Jim Evans is saying, I need to know if they stop, coming around a bad curve here. I just, that's what I need to know, if they stop. And as they started to wind up this real perilous road, it turns out that Baldy Notch Road had been washed out at 7,000 feet. And that's what's eventually stopped the truck. Jim Evans, you can hear him saying, I'm coming around a bad curve here. But at that time, it takes 15 seconds. Nobody's fault. It just takes 15 seconds before the helicopter can relay to Jim that truck is stopped, and that the people in the truck are now on foot. And what they've done is they jumped out of the truck, and they had lined up with those weapons. and they had waited for Jim Evans, followed by DJ McCarty, to come around a blind curve and then just open fire.
Yeah. So let's go back over to DJ, and can you pick it up there? You know, you and Jim McFerrin are behind Jim Evans. You come around this curve and kind of put us in, you know, in the shoes, your shoes, and what you saw and what you did as you kind of come face to face with these guys who are now unable to flee anymore, but are willing to, you know, shoot it out for whatever that's worth. So take us there.
Well, McFerrin was driving, I was passenger, and we're passing vehicles constantly going up this dirt road. And finally, I guess somebody got through claymores to a lot of the other officers, and a line of them pulled over. I think that Evans didn't hear that, and he pulled in front of us. So now Jim's lead, and we're behind Jim. We had no idea that we were actually the first lead vehicles. So we're following them. We're going around the corners, and we're watching 40 King, and 40 King's trying to give directional travel to us on if they stop or whatever they're doing. And at one point, Jim's vehicle just jams on the brakes. And McFerrin and I are sitting there going, what is he doing? Because again, we didn't know we were the lead pursuit units. So on the turn of the road and where the mountain was, McFerrin could see from his angle that I couldn't. And what he saw was the ambush. So Mac jumped out to grab cover, went to the rear of the vehicle. When Mac jumped out, I looked at him to the left, and I looked forward, and all of a sudden I see Jim Evans exit his vehicle, and he's outstretched and he's firing. And he's firing and backing up towards the rear of his vehicle. And he goes around behind his vehicle and he drops down. And it's at that point where I see that all hell's breaking loose now. The mountainside, rock, dirt, broken glass, plastic from the head, everything's blowing up. And I see Jim drop down directly in front of my car. And what I'm telling you right now happened within seconds of Jim leaving the passenger side of it, or the driver's side of his vehicle, coming around to the back. He drops down, and I was sitting in the vehicle and I was watching him. And then I see him, in those days it was a wheel gun, a revolver. We didn't have automatics then. He breaks it, he opens it up, he dumps his dead rounds out, he grabs his speed loaders, he puts them back into the gun, and he just starts to get ready to go up. And I remember sitting there for a split second going, damn, this guy's good, because he's under fire and he's reloading. Problem is there was nothing I could do. It happened so fast. Jim stood up in the same place that he went down. And I saw one of the suspects step up on the berm and point his rifle. And right when Jim came up, he took a round in the right eye. His body drops to the ground. They see me in a bright red windbreaker, because I was just getting off duty, and they annihilate the front of my car. At that point is when I tried to go into survival mode to get the hell out of there.
Yeah. And so you got behind the car and returned fire, or?
Well, you got to remember, I was getting off duty, and I walked out to the back to show the sergeant where the weapon was. I had no weapon other than that rifle. So when my windshield blew up and the shrapnel went into my face, a bullet went through my right elbow, and bullets were just flying everywhere in the car. The only thing I could do is I had the rifle between my legs. So the bullets are coming in, so I leaned to my left and laid down on the front seat. Bullets are still coming in the car, so I go, okay, I'm basically trapped the rifle, but I can get the shotgun. No, I can't get the shotgun, because I'd have to right myself to get out of its electric lock mechanism to bring the shotgun out. So remember, this is all seconds. I look out the passenger or the driver's door, which is open, and I see treetops. Well, being a country boy, knowing those mountains real well, I knew that that's a cliff off the edge of that. So I kicked open my right door, passenger door, on purpose to draw their fire, which they annihilated. And I rolled out of the car and under it and dug a hole as fast as I could to get underneath it, unarmed.
Well, I think probably it's time for us to open things up to some questions that people have been sending in. I'll start off with one question that we've gotten multiple versions of this from people, which is, when's the movie coming out?
Well, it has been optioned for film, and very good director. They've not announced who it is, so we aren't. But you know, it's got a very good chance to see the light of day as either a film or a multi-episode on one of the streaming channels or something like that. But we're happy with the people that picked it up, and we'll see where it goes from here.
Okay. Let's see, we've talked about some of these. I guess another question I saw earlier today when I was looking was, someone was curious about whether you had spoken to either Jim Evans' wife or his children. I think he had a fairly large family at the time of his death, and kind of how they have done since then. And, you know, did any of specifically they ask if any had gone into law enforcement like their father.
Well, needless to say, they're all profoundly affected by this. I spent a day with Mary Evans, and she is a delightful person who is, she is such a great storyteller that she's just a very charismatic, interesting, they had an incredible background. They were two people who had finally found the perfect person, the love of their lives, and to have it end so quickly afterwards, soon after they'd met. They had one child together, JB Jr., James Bernard Jr., and I did speak with him, but I only spoke with him afterwards. He was only 6 months old at the time, so his you know, the impact on him is afterwards. Jim had children from other marriages with whom I did not speak, and then Mary had children also. But you know, it had a profound effect on him, and certainly, you know, stories like this really do exist on a human level, and that's you know, talking to the Evans family is really you know, where you see that. I don't know, Jim Jr. has done some things related to law enforcement, but he's not a law enforcement officer per se. Delightful guy, really looks a lot like his father as well.
Okay. We also received a few questions around the theme of what changed after this, whether it was specific to the departments that were involved in this, the many, you know, the city and county and state departments that were involved with this, or maybe you know, more broadly, how policing has changed to be perhaps able to respond differently to a situation like this. And either of you, DJ, since you were with the department, maybe let's start off with you on that. Did San Bernardino County Sheriffs, you know, make changes after this, or other departments in the area make changes?
Well, during that time, we were right in the middle of an election for sheriff. And after that, just about everything changed. We eventually went to automatic handguns. We got a little bit more sophisticated in our weaponry, which was a Ruger 223 weapon that we carried, and it wasn't as nasty looking as a military weapon. It looked more like a .22 rifle, but it had the firepower of a military weapon. Communications, the cars that we had. Hey, you know what? A Ford Fairmont is a cheap car, and that's what we had at that time, and it is a cheap car. Those bullets went through that thing like butter. The only thing that was stopping them was the engine. They didn't handle well. They were just not a patrol car. Patrol cars got to be a little bit wider and a little bit heavier. They can take a lot of abuse. just about everything changed. We went from our SWAT team that was a kind of a weekend warrior type thing, nothing against the guys, but they would come from Central Patrol, just regular deputies, and they would train like once a month or something to do it. And then from that point, after the shooting, we went to a full-time 24-hour professional SWAT team.
Okay. Here's one for Peter. Mary Cox asks that you mentioned you were hearing things right up until you went to press. What's something interesting that you didn't get in the book that you wish you had? Have you learned something?
Yeah, I just was recently contacted by Paul Benoit, who was the spotter in Baker 1. And Baker 1 was the helicopter out of Riverside City, Riverside PD, who shadowed them above Mira Loma, picked up the pursuit above Mira Loma. And you can, again, I have all the Riverside, courtesy of Rolf Parks, a deputy who I just saw comment here, so I know he's online. But Rolf provided me with the radio traffic, and Paul Benoit is certainly a presence on that radio traffic. He confirmed something I had heard about, in that it was likely that their chopper was also hit by gunfire over Mira Loma. It was about a few weeks later, then on a routine inspection, they found a round had gone through the skid, and they couldn't be sure because it's surprisingly more common than you would think for police planes and helicopters to take fire. But so he said, yeah, it looks like we did get hit with a round over Mira Loma. And a number of people have come up and gotten a hold of me who I just couldn't find or didn't even know I needed to find them during the book. But that's certainly one example.
Okay. We also got a couple of questions, including one from Craig and Patty Chubbuck about how did the gentleman who was shoved in the cabinet on his truck in his van, I think was it Gary Hakala?
Gary Hakala, yeah.
Hakala, how did things turn out for him? How did he get freed from his predicament, and how did he deal with this horrible situation that he found himself in? How did he recover from the post-traumatic stress or whatever you might have experienced from something like that?
Yeah, Gary is a fascinating man. There's no doubt, and it's almost it almost feels not right to refer to him as a hostage because it makes it sound passive, which of course it's not. Because Gary is a very tough guy, comes out of Wyoming, very tough childhood, he just stopped at the Brea Mall to fix a side mirror and got 3 guns shoved in his face. So he played it cool and did exactly what he should have done, which is just go along and ride it out. But he was a total of 5 hours in that van with them, and that van was riddled by gunfire. He still has problems hearing in one ear from the bank robbers being next to him, firing out the back window of the van. Gary managed to free himself after the van had been disabled at 4th and Hamner in front of the bank, and the bank robbers had bailed out of the van. He pushed his way. He had been taped up hand and foot, and he managed to push himself out of a cabinet, wriggle out a back window, and kind of work his way and bunny hop and roll out. He's still not thrilled to this day that the police held their guns on him, but they didn't know what was going on at this point, who was coming out of this van. But yeah, Gary's a very brave guy. He went on to become a teacher in the Beaumont school system, and he was a teacher of the year, a really impressive guy, NRA instructor. He's a kayaker instructor. His students, I always get messages from his students. Once a year, he would stand up and he would tell his class the story of the Norco bank robbery. But he's a fascinating man.
Okay, I just glimpsed a question popping up from I think it was a Timothy Smith for DJ. Wanting to know a little bit more about how you got how your story on the mountain was resolved. We left you under the car, unarmed and under the car. So maybe you could finish that part of the story. You know, how did you and Jim McFerrin either eventually get back up, or you know, how were you able to get out of that that spot you were in?
Well, at that time I was 6'2", about 200 pounds, and I got my body underneath a Ford Fairmont that had about 4 or 5 inches of clearance after digging a hole under it. And I was under the car, and Mac was yelling to me, "Are you okay?" He kept yelling it. And while I was under the car, Mac is behind me. I'm in between him and the suspects. Well, now they figured it out that somebody's still alive. So now they're starting to bounce rounds under the car. So I yell at Mac, "Shut the F up and throw me a gun." And that wasn't going to work because Mac sure wasn't going to give up the only gun that he had. So I figured, well, I'm either going to die under this car like this, or I'm going to have to do something. So I crawled back out from under the car, reached up into the driver's seat, and thank God my hand went right on the barrel on the seat of the rifle, and I pulled it out. And again, God must have been watching me, because it dragged the 2 clips that were taped back to back on it. And I got the malfunctioning weapon that we didn't know was broken to work, and returned fire.
This is the AR-15?
Yes, when it was tossed out of the window of the vehicle that we were pursuing, if you remember, I told you any weapons that we have, or any off-duty weapons that deputies carry, have to go to range to be checked. Well, if we would have done that, we would have lost that AR. So we never brought it in. We didn't know that it was malfunctioning.
Okay.
Yeah, there is quite a period of time there where that's harrowing, to say the least, when those suspects are coming down this road with the 3 high-powered weapons and spraying gunfire into the pursuing police vehicles, Jim Evans and DJ McCarty. But there'd been some coming up, but they were taking the brunt of it, and they were walking down that hill, and they were going to disable as many police cars as they could, and to stop that pursuit line. So DJ was under constant fire, and one DJ, you know, he certainly knows this, and I've had been up in that canyon and fired guns up there as well. And the reports, the echoes of coming back and forth off the canyon walls. You had 4 semi-automatic weapons firing off hundreds of rounds and echoing off the canyon walls. It's a terrifying thing, and there's no overstating how perilous that road is at that point. When DJ says it's a cliff, it's a drop right off the side. So it was quite an experience DJ went through, and quite a heroic actions for sure.
I just wanted to let you know that we're going to go a little bit past 6 o'clock. I know that's what we said we would end at, but we've got so many good questions that Peter and DJ have both agreed to stay another 15 minutes. Or 10 or 15 minutes. So we'll try to go through some more. So if you can stick with us, we're going to go about that much longer. Here's a question. Here's a question for DJ, which is kind of nice and specific. What did you tell your wife, parents, roommate that night? And, and how long did it take you to kind of decompress and kind of, recover from the adrenaline and the stress and fear and everything that you faced up there that night?
I wasn't married at the time, and my roommate was Mike Lenahan, who was the 3rd officer up to back me. I didn't tell my parents or family, and it's something that'll never go away, but you just live with it.
Okay. Another question, these are a couple of small ones that we can probably go through quickly. How much money did they actually come out of the bank with?
$20,000. They had waited so long that the more money went out of that bank than came into that bank. 1980, not nearly as much happened on credit cards. So much happened on cash, and that was Friday payday, and a number of there's the naval base that's down the road, and people were coming in all day and cashing their paychecks and putting half in the bank and walking out with half. So by the time they robbed that bank, they were just down to the reserve drawers. In fact, the Norco branch, the Security Pacific Bank, had ordered more cash to be delivered, but it did not show up in time. So it was a terrible take for a takeover robbery, where takeover robberies they hope to get a few $100,000 at least.
I think I glimpsed this from Ralph Parks, one of the other deputies involved in this, flashing on the screen, that after this changed the way police responded to these types of events. Could maybe start with DJ? You know, if a takeover robbery at a bank happened after this later in the 80s, were you guys trained to respond to it in a different way, having studied what happened in this case?
Well, yeah, this whole episode has been studied up, down, left, and right. And it's basically, you have to take every one of those, from a burglary alarm to a bank alarm, you have to take them as it's happening. And again, it would be completely different. I'd been on patrol for less than a year. After the shooting, I volunteered and was accepted to go to the SWAT team. So a year after the shooting, they would have run into a different type of man fighting back. I would like to say one thing, though, before we go off, is the other officers that were involved, especially Ralph Parks. I think Ralph had like 3 cars shot out from under him. He was grabbing cars and jumping into them. And I met Ralph. In the book, there's a picture of him and I getting out of the helicopter. That's Ralph in front of me, and that's me behind him, with brown hair and a waistline. But it's just, to answer your question, the weaponry, the communications, the pursuit itself, on how many people will be involved in a pursuit, that isn't, the shooting itself isn't what we're used to getting into. I mean, if you remember the Hollywood shooting, where those 2 fully automatic body armor, it's chaos, absolute chaos. And you got to handle it the best way you can. In my instance, when I was in the front seat of that car, I was scared to death. All I know is I saw treetops, so I knew that was a cliff. Muscle memory and training, I kicked that right door open to draw the fire, and I went out the other door. I don't remember doing it. It's training. I'd love to say, yeah, I shot them all up. No, a brave man saved my life, gave me enough time to react, because I was frozen for a very short time, like I was in a movie theater, and watching this man fight to his death, and save my life and many other afterwards.
Another small specific question. This comes from Stephen Maybaum, who asks whether the Security Pacific alarm system wasn't connected properly to the Norco Police Department. Was there there is something in there, right?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. There was a teller that managed to hit the silent alarm, and the alarm went to the Corona Police Department instead of the Sheriff's Department. And the Corona Police Department interpreted the alarm as coming from the Security Pacific Bank in Corona, and that's where the initial dispatch went to, where the Corona PD descending upon the Corona branch of the Security Pacific Bank 5 miles away. So they had incorrectly wired the bank.
Okay. This one might be a question for DJ. This comes from Cindy Cox Osorio, who says that her father, James R. Cox, was a San Bernardino County Sheriff's deputy, and she vaguely remembers him being involved in this up in the mountains, and there was a newspaper clipping up in the mountains, but that he passed 20 years ago, and she just is curious if you might know how he was involved, or anything about what he might have done up there.
I don't remember what Jimmy was doing at that time, or I was a little busy at myself and getting flown out of there. But tell Cindy that I know Jimmy Cox, or did know Jimmy Cox very well. For 14 weeks, I hated his guts because he was my TO. After that, I love the man. He was a kick to work with, Cindy. He was a good guy.
Okay. All right.
And you know, Cindy, if you want to get a hold of me through my website, the name doesn't jump out, but I've got documents and reports and things like that, and maybe we'll find something in there.
Okay. Question from Julie Williams. Do you know how, and I guess this is for you, probably for you, Peter, do you know how the robbers were able to get all of this weaponry, high-powered weaponry and ammunition, given that law enforcement officers weren't even issued these kinds of guns?
Yeah, they were all legally purchased. They had collected weapons over time, and then as the run-up towards the robbery, they loaded up on the AR-15s and the hecklers, and of course, the explosive devices were not legal. Everything else was. You know, those weapons have always been legal. They just weren't as around as much, and not as prevalent. Although I bet you DJ could tell you they were starting to see them show up on the streets. If I understand DJ, mostly with the drug gangs and things like that. But they're not nearly as you know, prominent now and common now. But they were all legally purchased.
Okay. We had a couple of questions related to the robbers, both, you know, what it was like to meet them and interview them in prison, and this one is from D. Hammond. You know, what if you had any sense of what their families went through as a result of what these five guys did? You know, I mean, I think George Smith might have had kids, maybe a wife.
Yeah, you know, this event was devastating in so many ways, and so many so many children lost, you know, effectively lost parents, and you know, certainly Jim Evans' family, obviously, but you know, the Delgado's parents had two of their children, you know, go out the door one morning and never come back. Same with the Harvins. They had no idea. They hadn't done anything wrong. There were kids throughout. George, Chris, Russ had a kid. Manny had a child. You know, and it was absolutely devastating for them. And I did speak with a number of family members, as well as, you know, the surviving bank robbers, and wrote back and forth with George Smith. And you know, those, as I said, they didn't have any criminal records. Going into this, these are five young men who did an extremely stupid thing, and I'm not trying to mitigate in any way, shape, or form, but essentially threw their lives away in a single afternoon and damaged and destroyed the lives of a tremendous amount of people along with it, including their own family members, children, brothers, sisters, parents. It's you know, it's just a terrible, terrible, tragic thing. This event. Okay.
This is probably more of a law enforcement question, but Peter, you may know from your research as well. Was any thought given to backing off and trying to catch them later, given how, you know, violent they had made clear they were going to be?
DJ, you might be able to. I never did come across anything that said that there was arguments about strategy that should be taken. It was pretty much they were trying to pursue these guys. They were afraid if they got up those canyons too far, they very well might get away. There was a cloud cover coming in. The helicopters had to peel off pretty soon. But I don't know, DJ. It's one of those things. You know, what would you do now, or what would you have done afterward if a pursuit like that started to head up in those mountains? Would you back off, or?
No, I wouldn't have backed off. I'd have just felt a little.
No, I wasn't second guessing you. I just meant, you know.
I understand, Peter. It's just that it's. I stayed 33 years, and I stayed basically because of them, the suspects. I wasn't going to have my life destroyed by them. A lot of lives were destroyed. What was the original question, though? That
whether they're why not back off and like pull back some, you know, knowing that they were probably going up dead end roads up there. But like, I think Peter kind of touched on that. Maybe they could have gotten through the woods, but what do you think about that?
Well, I took it as, why did we even try to stop them? Why didn't we just let them go with the money? Am I getting that wrong or what? Because if it is, that's the question, then that's not my job. Yeah. My job is to stop them. And we didn't really have a chance to let them go, if you want to put it that way, because they came out shooting. And
Yeah,
poor
yeah,
Black,
yeah, I hear what you're saying, DJ. Yeah, but people have asked, so yeah, I think it's I've asked, just about tactics, like what the heck do you do when you got something like this good going down? So yeah, I think it was just you pursue them and you try to get them, is what everybody has told me on it.
Yeah. Training, your training kicks in and you do your job. Like I said before, if they would have came across me, if I'd have been in that shooting a couple of years later, it would have been a different outcome. I might have been dead, but I might have taken a couple of them with me. I think Jim Evans was just phenomenal. He was, if you'll remember when we met, Peter, I told you that I wanted two things if I talked to you. And do you remember what they were?
Yeah.
Okay. It was number one, I want the book dedicated to Jim Evans, which you said it, you already did. And the next thing I told you is, if you lie, I can find you.
I'm a long way away.
Yeah. Well, that might be a good place to stop.
Probably so. I do want to, Mr. Larson, I do want to thank everybody that was so interested in listening to this, because the more people that read the book and the more people that do what we're doing today keeps Jim Evans's memory alive. He fought a war. He fought law enforcement, and he died a very, very brave man, and he saved a lot of lives. We'll never know what would have happened if he hadn't done what he did.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's our pleasure. It's our pleasure to bring some light to a fascinating, episode like this in a terrific book that recounts it. So I want to thank everybody who has watched and stuck with us to the end for joining our latest SCNG Newsmakers virtual event. I want to thank our special guest, Peter Houlahan, and our extra special surprise guest, DJ McCarty. We really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us today. As always, I'd encourage everyone to read our newspapers and websites to stay informed, and perhaps equally important, to find ways such as tonight's event to be entertained. I mean, it's a serious topic, but hopefully this is something that you've enjoyed listening to and finding out about. So thank you very much, and please stay safe out there, everybody.
Thank you all.
Thank you.